Hi guys, today we're gonna take a look at the quickest win by Garry Kasparov. It's a really impressive game and we'll not only enjoy the beauty of the combination played by Garry Kasparov, but we'll also kind of get into his head and we'll see exactly how he could find these moves so that you can emulate his thinking process in your own games. Garry Kasparov is playing white against Guy West, and actually an interesting thing is that at this time, Garry Kasparov was only 14 years old, and yet, as you can see, he was already a really strong player. Right here, you can see that the West is trying to get Garry into the maybe a little less known lines, which usually happen after White plays e5, but Garry prefers to stay on the well-known variations, and he goes knight to c3. Perhaps he doesn't want to let his opponent use his home preparation. Black goes pawn to e6, and after pawn to d4, it transposes into the usual lines of Sicilian defense. And yet, in this time, Guy West once again plays bishop b4, a little bit of a sideline, and a kind of aggressive one. As you can see, Black just imposed a pin on the white side, and therefore he's threatening to capture that pawn on e4 because of that pin. However, White does not have to defend, he can actually move forward, which is exactly what Garry did. He played pawn to e5, attacking the knight. Black played knight to d5, creating another threat. This time, both of the Black's minor pieces are attacking the white's knight, and it requires an additional support. So Kasparov played bishop to d2, and then after Black exchanged the knights, he actually went with his bishop all the way back to f8. At first, it may seem like a really weird move, or maybe Black is planning to resign very soon playing against Garry Kasparov, and he already started putting his pieces back in their initial position, kind of preparing for the next game. Of course, I'm kidding, but in fact, it does make some sense, because if Black plays a more natural move, something like bishop to e7, there is a bit of a problem that can happen here. How would you play here as White, by the way? Let me ask you this question. In this position, White has a powerful attacking move. Queen goes to g4, attacking the pawn on g7, and it's somewhat uncomfortable for Black to defend it, really, because if Black once again makes the most natural move, which is costly, in this case, White can use a tactical motif by playing bishop to h6, and because the pawn is pinned, Black obviously cannot capture the bishop, and the only way for him to defend the g7 pawn is to move it forward, which would allow White to grab the rook, getting some material advantage. And that is why, because of this variation, Black cannot really go bishop to e7, as we just have observed a few moves ago. Now let's come back to the actual game, where the real fun is going to begin really soon. Black played bishop to f8, and Kasparov played bishop to d3, developing one more piece. At this time, you can already see that Black's situation is quite dangerous, because he actually still has all the pieces on their initial squares, while White already brought almost all of his pieces into play. Anyway, Black played pawn to d6. It does make sense, he needs to develop his pieces somehow. And here at this point, Kasparov made another very good move, because in a position like that, very often players tend to unthinkingly capture the pawn on d6, which is an easy solution, but at the same time, it only helps Black, because if White captures the pawn, it gives Black a chance to develop his bishop without actually spending extra time for development. And you may say that White actually helps Black to develop his bishop. And that is why there is a rule which you're probably familiar if you're following my previous videos, which is to take is a mistake. Usually in a situation like that, it is better to keep up the pressure instead of releasing the tension and making the capture yourself. That is why Kasparov played queen to e2, keeping up the pressure and keeping all of his pieces active. And in this position, Black played knight to d7, which was quite an interesting move, and also it's actually quite an interesting mistake. And at this point, Kasparov found a way to win the game right now. So I would encourage that you pause the video and think about it for a few seconds if you can find the winning shot for White here. And if you can, then please write it down in the comments below so that I can follow up and see what is the solution that you found here. And the winning move is knight takes e6. Really interesting combination, and the point of the combination is that temporarily, because of that knight on d7, Black cannot recapture the knight with the bishop, and therefore he has to recapture by the pawn. But in this case, white can start chasing black's king, playing queen to h5, check, and then if black goes king to e7 right away, then bishop to g5, almost checkmates the king, and white is obviously going to have a very significant material advantage. Or if black plays pawn to g6, then it only postpones similar consequences. White is going to first of all sacrifice the bishop there, and after that, if king goes to e7, white still plays bishop to g5, attacking the king as well as the queen, and the only way for black would be to play knight to f6, but again white can capture the knight and then the queen, and the game is over for black here. So that was the main line of this combination which Kasparov needed to calculate before capturing the black's pawn on e6. However, in the actual game, black actually refused to accept the sacrifice, and he played another move which also brought really interesting consequences. Let's take a look. In the actual game, black decided that, alright, if I accept this knight sacrifice, I'm going to lose immediately. However, at the moment, black is only down one pawn, which is not such a terrible thing, and that is why he decided to simply refuse to accept the sacrifice, and he played queen to b6, hoping that white will somehow move away the knight or trade it for the black's bishop, and the game would go on. However, at this point, Kasparov found one more tactical shot, which is even more unusual one, and that is why at this point I would once again ask you to think about the position yourself and to let me know if you can find the winning combination right here. I'll give you a few more seconds to think about this, as this combination is a bit more complex than the previous one, even though, overall the motif is more or less the same. So, at this position, Kasparov played knight to c7, and black was so shocked that he resigned immediately. And, well, white is actually winning. At the moment, the knight is attacking both the king and the rook, therefore, in order to save the rook, black has to take the knight. However, after that, you can probably guess that white is going to play pawn takes d6, which is a discovered check to black's king, and at the very same time, also an attack to the black's queen. Therefore, in the next move, white would grab the queen and get the decisive material advantage, while continuing his attack against the black's king, so black just resigned. Really beautiful game by Garry Kasparov, but I'd like to also take a moment to share with you how you can find these kind of tactical shots, as well as how you can calculate variations in your own games. Because it's one thing when you're solving a tactical drill and you know in advance that there is a certain tactics there, but it's another thing when you're playing your actual game and nobody tells you that at this point you need to find some winning shot, right? That's another situation. So let me take a few steps back, and I'm just gonna show you exactly how grandmasters can find and calculate consequences of their moves so quickly. Let me even take one step back and start from here. So the very first thing that I would love to suggest to you is this. First of all, why did black play knight to d7, which is a little bit awkward? It's closing the bishop, it's closing the queen, right? Instead of moving the knight to c6. He probably didn't want to corrupt his pawn structure, which could happen if white would trade the knights on c6 or something like this. He had some positional ideas about why is knight d7 better. But the first key takeaway that I would suggest you to remember is that I would always encourage that you value activity and freedom of your pieces higher than some other positional factors. Because really activity is the dominant principle of a chess game, and whenever you reduce your activity for some reason, there is a high chance that it's actually just a mistake. Just like in this game, instead of playing knight to c6, bringing the knight to the most forward, the most active square, black for some reason decided to play knight to d7. And again, without any particular calculation of variations, I would tell that your first impulse should be to bring the knight to c6, to the most active, to the most advanced square. And so after knight d7, now here's another task, right? How can you find winning combinations when you have an potential opportunity to execute one of them? And here's the golden rule of calculation. To simplify your calculation, you need to pay attention to the forced moves first of all. And the forced moves are the moves which force a particular reply from your opponent. The most forced move is a check, because your opponent has no choice but just to protect his king. The next forced move is a capture move, because usually your opponent has to recapture. And lastly, it is an attacking move which forces your opponent to defend. If you just keep this thing in mind, calculating variations becomes really easy, because you know that you don't have to calculate all the possible options that you can play in a position, just like sometimes the books, teaches you that you need to come up with all reasonable candidate moves and then calculate them one by one. And I mean, it's normal process, but it's a little complicated. Instead, you just can pay attention to forced moves. And again, the thing is pretty simple, because if you think about, can you deliver a check at the moment? And in the vast majority of the cases, the answer is no. And then you ask yourself, can I capture something? And if you think this way, you will notice that in this position, white can either capture that pawn on d6 or can capture the pawn on e6. And the choice is really slim, right? There is not that much that you have to calculate. Therefore, knight takes e6 will be the move in your radar, and you will start considering it. And after that, as you can see, in all the following variations, it is always either a check or a capture or an taken move, but for the most part, it all comes with checks and captures, all the way through till the end, right? And if you follow this method of calculation, things becoming really easy. Same thing if I now jump to the variation which happened in the game where black played queen to b6. At first, the move knight to c7 seems like a shocker, something really unexpected. But if you follow the right way of thinking, if you ask yourself first and foremost, how can I deliver a check? Then it is actually one of the very first moves that you need to consider, because again, there are only two checks that you can possibly deliver right now, which is knight takes g7 and knight to c7. Now, I don't say that you need to deliver a check all the time, but I do say that you need to consider it for at least a few seconds, and then you'll see whether it makes any sense or not. And in this game, it was a really beautiful combination which allowed white to win the game. And let me also make one announcement. In case you're interested in improving your calculation abilities, let me say that right now we're going to open up enrollment for one of my flagship courses, Calculate Till Mate. I created this course some time ago, and it's been one of the best sellers for a long time, because one of the most common kind of complaints that people tell me about their games is that they often get good positions, but then they lose it because of some miscalculation, because they just overlooked a certain move by their opponent. Or they're getting good positions, but it just takes for them too long time to calculate variations, and then they get in time trouble, especially in blitz games, and lose because of that. And therefore, despite of having really good position understanding, despite of outplaying their opponents and getting really good positions, getting even winning positions, ultimately they lose, which is obviously very annoying. And that is why I wanted to address this thing, and I've created this course, Calculate Till Mate, where I show you these techniques which I've got to touch a little bit within this video, but it's a short video, I can't cover everything. And within the course, I'm showing the step-by-step full process of how do you calculate variations properly, how do you find tactical shots, and exactly how grandmasters can do it quickly, easily, even in blitz games. So if you're interested, you can find out the details in the link below, and you can enroll into the course right now, where we will be following up with people, giving the tasks, helping you to get the most out of the course. Finally, I do hope that you enjoyed this video and you learned a few valuable takeaways from the video, and if so, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and I'm wishing you all the best, have a great day, and I'm going to talk to you very soon in my next videos.